So CIS, what is this? 278. Penetration testing, live and in living color. You know what I need? I need a macro. I need a macro that does all of this for me all at once. One of these days I'll break down and do it. But all right, so this is the first unit worth of pen testing certification exam stuff. Pretty excited about it. My plan, by the way, this is designed for the CompTIA Pentest Plus. I'm gonna teach this stuff to you guys, and then I'm gonna go sit down and take the test. So I'm gonna actually do this at the end of the semester. And if I reuse this material, you might be seeing this lecture next semester, and hopefully I passed. So there you go, commitment to you guys to make sure I get up off my butt and actually sit down and take the certification exam. I did that with the ethical council stuff, EC council stuff. It wasn't too bad. I did it with the Security Plus. I'll probably do it with the Security Plus 6.0, just so I know the chaos you guys are headed to. This is the objectives for the entire course. All right, so for the whole shebang, we want you to be able to talk about all of the different types of assessments you might do in penetration testing. So how to, and then so you can identify them, but you could also go through and talk about how you figure out how they're going to work, do the planning, work with the clients to get the what is in and what is out of scope piece figured out. And then also we want you to be able to look at scripts and analyze their output. And if you're wondering where we got these objectives from, they're the objectives for the Pentest Plus. So which is usually not a bad way to go about coming up with objectives for a course, because I've been on these committees. You get a bunch of industry experts into a room. They come up and give you ideas for what is important in their line of work. And then from that, they create the class materials. So a pretty good way to come up with what is important for cybersecurity experts. And in this case, what is important for penetration testers. So we want you to learn how to do OSINT by figuring out the appropriate techniques for that engagement. Depending on what it is you're doing, it might be appropriate to do a bunch of research on social media, but then in some other engagements it might not be, and you might be expected to just use the intel that the client gives you. Perform scanning of the network, which is when you go through on a network and look at all the available hosts, as well as enumerating, which tends to be breaking out what ports are available on what host, and then scan those enumerated hosts for vulnerabilities, which is a thing in itself, like a vulnerability assessment. And then when it becomes a pen test is when you've figured out those vulnerabilities, right? Your vulnerability assessment turned up some vulnerabilities. Then you choose exploits that will work against them. And what makes it a pen test is that you actually then exploit those vulnerabilities. So that's the difference between a real pen test and just the network administrators running some vulnerability analysis. A pen tester will actually break into the network and move through. So that may be through the sort of more technical vulnerabilities that we were talking about when you scan a network and you find this version of Microsoft SQL has this vulnerability in it. Exploit that vulnerability, take over the system. That's one way it can work. Another way it can work is you can use social engineering and physical intrusion. If you've met James King, he likes to say that his job is close to being a spy as you can get without working for the federal government. So that physical intrusion piece, the guys over there at VDA Labs, they keep one of those tactical kind of dudes on staff with a military background to do the physical intrusion parts of things. So sometimes it'll be like a scene from The Matrix where you've got an earbud in and directing people. It's fun and exciting, no doubt. No doubt. So you'll also need how to know how to exploit vulns on wired networks, how to use wireless networks against themselves. Start down the road of web app vulnerability analysis. So certainly you should be able to identify anything that like Metasploit can handle on a web app. Um, it's not a course in web vulnerability assessment, but that would be a nice next direction to pursue. That's kind of a hot area of assessment right now. You can make yourself some money on HackerOne if you get into that sort of thing. Um, but we'll at least get you started, introduce you to Burp Sweep, and show you what kind of stuff is in there. Similarly, you need to be able to take care of host vulnerabilities, which are those vulnerabilities that are on operating systems themselves, either because there's an unpatched vulnerability, perhaps a 0-day vulnerability, but again, developing O-days is beyond the scope of this course, and using those to gain access to a system. Once you've got access to that system, go from the regular user account you might come in as and elevate those privileges into like higher level, administrative type privileges, and then do the post exploitation stuff that goes along with establishing persistence and figuring out how to get back into the network if you needed to do that. And then the important part, where the real work of penetration testing unfortunately happens, is after a security engagement, going through and actually getting yourself paid by writing a formal report and talking about these are the strategies that the blue team can use in order to defend against these, to mitigate or to resolve the vulnerabilities we use to get into your network. So that's like where unfortunately where the real money comes from isn't all that sweet busting into people's systems and getting shells and all that stuff. Where the real money comes from is helping the blue team make sure that they can't get busted by the same vulnerabilities the next time you show up to do a penetration test. And if you talk to pen testers, they get really annoyed when they go to the same client year after year and get in using the same vulnerability year after year. And in fact, sometimes they'll just say, oh, yep, that's still there. Let's see if we can find another one. All right, so that's the overall goal of the course. For this first chapter, we're going to talk about security assessments. We're going to talk about what you use and how you prepare for that. So all these virtual machines we'll use for creating our virtual labs, planning, scoping of the engagement, and then we'll look at the output of various scripts, because that is one of the objectives on the Pentest Plus and a thing you probably should learn to do. So this chapter is broken down into 2 modules like the rest of these are. Actually, it's broken down into more than 2 modules. We're just going to cover the first 2 modules. We're going to do A and B, and we'll do the rest next week. So for the first of these modules, Module A, we're going to talk about vulnerability scans and what we're doing there versus a penetration test and what we're doing there. And they sound similar and they are connected, but quite different. So a vulnerability assessment is thus: you go through and take a look at all of the different components on the network, starting with what does the attack surface of our network look like? What is our exposure? Do we have web servers we need to worry about? Do we have an email server that we need to worry about? Do we do DNS? Do we have VPN appliances that connect to our network? So we have to figure out what is vulnerable. Do we have employees? If you do, they're part of the attack surface. A little more difficult to do vulnerability assessment on employees, but has anybody been phished by their employer?
Yeah, we have simulated phishes fairly often.
So we're kind of, that's assessing the vulnerability of the human, maybe depending on who's doing it, even pen testing. Probably just assessing though.
Yeah, I have not personally, but my brother fairly recently was at his job, and when he failed the phishing test, they then made him go through a mandatory training regarding it, and then immediately after he got out, they did it to him again.
Well, yeah, because like they're trying to remediate the vulnerability that is your brother.
Yeah.
If we could just teach this guy how to do this, we'll be in business.
Yeah, I can't remember if we actually have training. I think we might have just like one kind of standard training that they might send back out to people, but basically if you are one of the people that clicks on the simulated phish, you get added to the list so that you get sent them more often until you stop clicking on them, and then it just goes back to the right kind of regular schedule.
Now back to our regularly scheduled fishing. Yeah, not a bad move. But usually you need some kind of training in there somewhere, right? So you can help people like get better. If you just fish them more and more and more and more,
just keep sending them more fishes.
we're just gonna make this harder and harder for you. That's not cool. So yeah,
so the password reset emails. This is weird.
Every morning. So it helps. So to do one of these vulnerability assessments, we figure out what our attack surface looks like. Ideally, you can figure out, this is especially in the blue team side, you can figure out what normal looks like. So once you know normal, you can find evil. I think I stole that line from Sands. But so once you've got a baseline figured out, this is what the network looks like normally. These are what the system's processes look like normally, that kind of thing. How deep you go into that baseline is another story, but what have you. We've got to figure out the design of our assessment. What is it we're actually going to do? And then we're going to assess the controls, so like, and procedures, which are kind of more along the lines of how we manage, how we do things. So like, how do we manage our backups? How do we manage our firewalls? How do we manage training our people to resist the fish? That kind of stuff. So that's the assessment of our network, of our systems on the network, of the people using the systems on our network, to come up with, what our vulnerabilities actually look like. The different types of vulnerabilities of vulnerability assessments we can do can be like focused on particular objectives. So like, we've got this one server that's really important to us and it's how we make all our money. The objective will be to verify that there are vulnerabilities, there are no vulnerabilities, hopefully, on that server. If you're in a regulated industry, which almost everybody is, so if you're a healthcare provider, you've got to worry about HIPAA. If you take credit cards, you have to worry about PCI DSS. Many of those, actually PCI DSS is a good one to pick on here because it's like the Pentester Employment Act of 2020, whatever. It specifies if you deal with X amount of credit card transactions and you retain credit card info, you must have a penetration test every so often, and gives you guidelines for what that penetration test will include. So for compliance-based assessments, you can start the vulnerability assessment piece usually as an in-house thing and then bring in a third-party testing firm to do the actual pen test itself. In a large organization, you may have a dedicated red team that like this is their day in and day out. I do a lot of work with West Michigan's largest IT employer, and they, I think, have started calling their security group a purple team and still don't have like somebody whose job it is to come into work every day and pen test the office. Although they do focus on threat hunting, which is basically taking your network administration sort of to the next level, where in your blue team, your network operations center or your security operations center starts with the understanding that the network has probably been breached and starts hunting around the network looking for indicators of compromise, or IOCs, on the network, keeps track of network traffic, pays a sort of defense on the next level. So it's a more aggressive approach to handling intrusions. So any of those scopes might include a vulnerability assessment of some sort. So you might do a vulnerability scan with like a Nessus or a Greenbone security assessment, I think is the name of the freeware one that people use, that will go through and non-intrusively, so like you set it to kitty mode so it doesn't break anything, look at all the things on the network, right? Scan through looking for known vulnerabilities, stuff that's already been documented. You probably won't find zero-day vulnerabilities, and other things like poorly configured systems. We used Spiceworks has like a rudimentary version of this where it'll go and it'll tell you if you have changed the administrator passwords, or is there a common password across a bunch of systems, that sort of thing.
A quick question, if I may.
Go.
So I have heard stories of sometimes like vulnerability scans or even just like network scans taking devices offline and causing issues in the network. Besides just like when you run a like network scan that just floods the network with packets, how could that actually like take devices offline?
Well, hopefully a good one won't. But if you have a device with a particularly fragile network stack, that somebody didn't do a very good job of coding, um, you know, abnormal network traffic can lead to abnormal results. So good vulnerability assessments are generally going to give you options for how intense they are. And if you keep it down to the don't break stuff level, you'll probably be okay. But you can like crank them up to send crazy amounts of packets to all kinds of crazy places, even with like an Nmap scan. You can do this Christmas tree scan that sends all these unusual packets places, and particularly with like like again systems that are old, that weren't very well designed, that weren't designed with security in mind, blow up when you send them weird network traffic sometimes. And I mean, this is less true these days than it was back in the day. But I mean, if you remember in the 90s, there was this thing on Windows systems called the ping of death. And if you just sent a malformed ping packet to a Windows box, it fell over. Which, if you were trying to get your buddies off of IRC, it was kind of funny. But like on the real internet, that's not cool these days. So yeah, that is totally a thing. And usually why there's like multiple levels of how aggressive a vulnerability scan is going to be. Good question. Please keep asking them, because otherwise, just talking about PowerPoint slides, not fun. Even although talking about PowerPoint slides about Pentest is pretty good. So the difference between vulnerability scan and Pentest, I think I made this point earlier, but the Pentests are where you take that vulnerability assessment, there are some vulnerabilities, and now you're going to say, oh yeah, let's see if I can actually exploit them. And that's definitely where you can break stuff. So it's important that the organization you're working with is aware of that. This used to be shrouded in mystery and kind of spooky. I don't know, maybe even as recently as 5-6 years ago for some organizations. Now I think everybody's pretty much got a handle on what we're doing when we do a pen test. If you're a CIO of an organization, so you know what you're getting into, and so so one of the things I like about the gig teaching at the U of M is they give me TAs, which is cool. I like having TAs, and the TAs tend to be people who are like doing security work in the field and who like just want to give back to the community, kind of, because like if you're making six figures as a blue team or a pen tester, you really don't need the $60 or whatever they're paying you to come and hang out. But they've got great stories, and one of them was my one TA was a pen tester, and my other TA was the CIO, kind of the CISO of a healthcare thing over on the east side of the state, and it was funny because the pen tester was all cocky, and the CISO guy was like, "Yeah, I make those guys come in at 2 in the morning, so they can't break anything important." And Xavier, the pen tester, was kind of like, "Yeah, that's a thing." So it's cool work, but sometimes you are going to be expected to work odd hours when you do that sort of stuff, because you don't want to find out that. So like I use the healthcare setting a lot because I get some experience with some of the hospitals around town. And you don't want to discover that the $1 million, CAT scan machine blows up when you send it a malformed packet, right, in the middle of CAT scanning somebody. And actually, CAT scan machines, I guess, are so expensive that they try and run them around the clock. All right, so that's pen test versus vulnerability scan. Your vulnerability scanners, and we will look at like OpenVAS. You can pay for Saint and Nessus. We'll go through and they'll actually do the enumeration piece and the network scanning piece for you if you want. But we'll look at like specific tools that can do just that. You can have them. Different ones will be better at certain things. OpenVAS is working with the openly accessible stuff, kind of the community taking care of folks, although they've got a paid product you can pick up. But they can be specific for various network services, better with different OSs or apps. Some of them, we're beginning to see stuff like focused on IoT devices, so things that'll break your Alexas and your, Hue light bulbs and that kind of stuff. And then two big distinctions on how you can do a vulnerability scan are whether they're credentialed or non-credentialed. So vulnerability scans will give you a lot better information if you make the vulnerability scanner an administrator on every system on the network while it's doing the scan, but that might make the security people a little nervous. It is the right way to do it, though. I mean, if you really want to know all of the things, which are like, do we have controls we're supposed to be doing that we're missing? Are we running services that we don't need to be running? Are passwords or encryption crap? This and this are basically the same thing. Do we have data out there that is supposed to be protected that's not protected? Do we have systems that are like running creepy copies of TeamViewer or some other kind of indicator of compromise that would tell us that that system is a backdoor for somebody who's already there? Or, and this is like what you normally think about when you're thinking about a vulnerability scan, is there some CVE related to this product that tells me that my web server is vulnerable to remote code execution, or my operating system has a vulnerability in it that lets anybody become the Active Directory domain administrator, which was a thing like 3 months ago. That's what we want out of a vulnerability test. Again, pen testing is taking that to the next level and actually doing something with that. And then if we're focused on compliance, we might have other things that we want to know about, right? We might want to make sure that the password policy we have in place is up to date and actually being enforced. Although all of the experts on passwords these days are like, make them long and easy for humans to remember and don't make people change them regularly until you're compromised, and then make them change them. If you're using SSH keys or other keys, that management is being done in the way you think it should be done, that will be important. That we've adhered to the principle of least privilege and not giving people access to stuff they don't need access to, or systems access to things they don't need access to. And then that where appropriate, we've isolated data so that, again, people need to know people who are supposed to get to it can get to it, and the people who aren't can't. All right, those are vulnerability assessments. How are you feeling about that? So far, so good?
So far, so good.
All right. See how my computer's feeling. It's sluggish and tired. I probably need to give it a restart too. We'll do that later. So pen testing is taking that to the next level. And there's a couple of ways you can come at a penetration test. The black box test will make you feel like you're making your pen testers work hard, but is probably the least efficient way to do a penetration test that you're paying for. So if you give them no knowledge of your network or your system or whatever, and just say, okay, boys, hack me. That is a thing. We call that a black box test. A white box test is probably a better deal for your money, where they give you the penetration tester as much knowledge of our existing security controls, the network configuration, all of our policies, any documentation about the stuff that's on the network ahead of time. And usually a toehold into the network, because you're probably wasting your money if you're going to make the penetration testers do your phishing assessment for you. Or break into your Wi-Fi network, or break into your network by sprinkling candy drops all over your parking lot and finding out who's going to plug the USB stick in. probably better just to give them a system on your network to start from and assume that somehow they got in. And a gray box test is somewhere in between there. In fact, snarky pen testers will argue that a white box test is really a gray box test because you very seldom will show up in an IT shop where they have good documentation on their existing security controls, system configurations, policies, network, and that sort of stuff. And at the end of the pen test, one of the deliverables that the penetration testing team will give back to the organization is a revised copy of those documents that is accurate, as opposed to whatever it is the IT team thought was going on there to begin with. So those are the three categories, although that most of them are somewhere in the land of the gray box. So depending on what it is you're concerned about, pen tests might look very different. So if you're concerned about advanced persistent threats getting into your network, state-sponsored actors getting into your network, you might ask the pen testers to go hard and to consider everything in scope on your network. However, if what you're concerned about is malicious insiders on your network or Russian mob types, that might be a different pen test there. You might back off a little bit. You might declare some things out of scope that maybe you would declare in scope otherwise. You might choose to handicap or nerf your pen testing team so that they're not going to use exploits of this nature, or you're not going to use any exploits that have the risk of taking a system offline because it's mission critical. And in that case, they would just note that in their assessment, but you haven't really got the whole benefit of the pen test in that case. You may not have your pen testers doing as comprehensive a job of scanning the network as your own IT team would do, since your IT team has the advantage of, if you give penetration testers the credentials to your network, you've basically given them the pen test. So your IT team or your blue team will have the advantage of being able to do a more comprehensive vulnerability scan. Since they're in a position to do a credentialed scan, they'll have administrative access on all the systems while they're scanning it. They should be able to find things out about password policies and implementation of any other policies you got for your Active Directory groups. Whereas the pen testers very rarely will have that kind of that level of access, because you don't want it to. The point is to see what an adversary would see in those situations. So there are our goals. Questions about that? All right. I'm not sure what I want to do about the rest of these, except maybe talk about them and review them. Since you can download the same set of slides, I was thinking I would go through and take the answers out. But you could look at them too, so. Ooh. What magic is that? Oh, yeah. All right, okay. So on the honor system here, and pretend like you didn't just see me flip to the next slide and back. Your client wants to find a missing or misconfigured security controls on a network full of critical servers that are so fragile they might have problems if they get non-standard traffic. And that was kind of what we were talking about with can you really blow up stuff on a network with a network scan? And yeah, sometimes you can. You must use the least intrusive method. Which of the following would you do? A, B, or C? Don't feel like you have to go on the record. You just make an A. No, I'm kidding. You can type it into the chat on Zoom if you really want to be shy. I'll have to open up the chat on Zoom so I can see it, but what do you think?
D would be my guess.
It would help to be a white box. Zach, where do you come down on this?
Yeah, I was gonna say C or D.
All right. Well, I'm glad we have the answer on the next slide because I don't want to screw this up. They're thinking they want you to do a credentialed vulnerability scan. And the reason they're saying that is because a credentialed vulnerability scan is going to log into those systems and wouldn't log into a system that it didn't have credentials for. So if we had that $1 million MRI or that $1 million CAT scan machine, if we didn't have an authorized way to get into it, it would probably skip right past it. Whereas a white box pen test would be a good start. That would be definitely like the half credit answer here, because you would at least know the $1 million MRI machine is on the network, and maybe you would declare it out of scope. Whereas a non-credentialed vulnerability scan doesn't have the advantage of knowing what it should and shouldn't get into. So it might try to get into the MRI machine just because it's on there.
So would you consider a credentialed vulnerability scan less intrusive then because of that than a non-credentialed one?
Yeah, and that's like a big, depending on how you set that up kind of thing.
Okay.
So if you will have the advantage of being able to set it up so that it's, if you can't log into this thing, leave it alone.
Okay.
All right. Question 2 for all the marbles. You've been charged with conducting a vulnerability scan. Which of the following are you likely to perform? Bypassing security controls, exploiting vulnerabilities. This is a vulnerability scan. Exploiting vulnerabilities, finding open ports, identifying vulnerabilities, passively testing security controls.
Does it speak up whenever, or?
Yep.
I'm going to go with D on this one.
Just D? So choose all that apply.
Oh, gotcha. Oh,
this is actually a good time to talk about test taking strategy.
Read the entire question, right?
Definitely a good one.
C, D, and E?
Yep, I agree with that.
All right. C, D, and E. Find some open ports, identify some vulnerability, do some passive security testing. A+ on that. And I guess if you're playing along at home, pause the video before we get to the answers here. Man, this is a wordy one. You're performing a compliance-based assessment of a system subject to PCI DSS 3.0 regulations, which, of course, you guys have already read PCI DSS 3.0.
Oh, yeah. Know it forwards and backwards.
Yeah. Which of the following findings would fail the assessment? Choose all that apply. Passwords need to be characters and letters. Passwords are stored and transmitted. Users are subjected to criminal background checks before they're cleared to use financial systems. Users must change passwords 60 days. And user workstations automatically lock after 30 minutes of idle time. You guys haven't memorized PCI DSS 3.0? How else might we come at this if we haven't? Another good strategy is to eliminate wrong answers first and kind of work from there.
So, pretty sure that C is incorrect, because I'm pretty sure that that is something that has to happen.
It depends if A is meaning it's limited to 6 characters.
Ooh, yeah, it just says required.
Yeah, it requires
I feel like that's light.
Not to be at least.
I was going to say, I feel like that's light on the requirements for a strong password policy, but I don't know how.
Well, this is also a tricky question on a couple of levels too, right? Because which of the following findings would fail the assessment? So you would fail if passwords were required to be 6 characters with a mix of letters.
If that's what it's meaning, then yes, A would be.
All right, so we like A.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with that.
Right.
So B is obviously wrong, because...
That sounds good,
yeah.
right? Sounds good.
Yep.
We like encrypted passwords.
Yep. D could be right. I just don't know if the PCI DSS 3.0 is like tougher than that or not.
I feel like it's trying to be a trick question in that just something there isn't right.
Or it might be like, it must be different than the last 12 passwords.
That's what I'm thinking, is that it's some number like that.
All right. So that one seems unreasonable. Which leaves us with E, lock after 30 minutes of idle time.
I feel like
Yeah, that or even less time, but I would say that's a pretty good one as well. So.
yeah, I would say less time, but at the same time, I feel like if it were much less, then you might have minor productivity issues.
It is.
I've seen it where they time out after like 5 or 10 minutes.
It is kind of a
like
hassle if it's too much.
15 maybe.
Yeah. So yay or nay? It says pick two or pick all that apply, which usually means at least two, right?
I'm gonna go with A and E then.
Yeah, I can agree with that.
You guys are smart. You got that one.
Yeah.
All right. Vulnerability assessments. While conducting a vulnerability assessment, you're given a set of documents representing the network's intended security configuration along with current network performance data. Which type of review are you most likely to perform? Are we going to look at network security configuration? Are we going to look at architecture? Are we going to review the baseline review? Are we going to look at code or design? We're trying to figure out, you're given a set of documents that represent the intended security configuration along with network performance data.
A maybe?
Yeah. I was going to say, if you're looking at the intended security configuration along with the performance data, I feel like you're kind of looking at the architecture and if it's set up correctly.
Well, half of it sounds like the architecture, right?
Yeah.
If you're given the documents that talk about the intended configuration,
Otherwise,
when you bundle in the performance data, you're kind of looking at
baseline.
Yeah, how the network normally works.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what we're looking for.
Okay.
Yeah. As an IT technician, you're instructed to assist outside pen testers, giving them complete documentation of your network and your configuration, which is for sure going to be good. What type of test are you performing then? Are they performing?
C.
Yep. So that's the definition of a white box test. You give them the lay of the land. All right. Well, that was the last one. All right. So I'm gonna stop